It is straight up 1:30. Good afternoon, everybody. On this, if you're in Michigan, very nice summer feeling May day. I'm Jana Broughton. I am a quality improvement advisor with Superior Health Quality Alliance, and joining me today is Jessica Henkel, Patty Leonard, and Amy Magner, who are all three also quality improvement advisors with Superior Health. And today we're going to be doing part 3 of our infection prevention work group discussion. And last week we did leave off with a section to be completed. And in discussion with my peers, we're going to cover that in week 6. The section that Patty had created so well about pulling it all together and looking at what she was going to present on, we thought, this really fits nicely kind of at the end of our presentations where we talk about how you use all this information, pull it together and apply it to your program. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Jessica. So Jessica, you can go ahead and get started. I will go off camera and then Patty, Amy, jump in, help me with any chats and putting up the polls as we get to them. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jenna. I think, so we're going to skip from the bloodborne pathogens into environmental services to start us off today. So we're going to talk about the importance of providing a clean, safe, and home-like environment. So often when we do an ICAR with a facility, we get to the environmental services section and kind of have blank stares, just because we do the ICARs with nurses, and often nurses and environmental services aren't doing the same things. And so we just wanted to kind of do some education around environmental services to help the infection preventionists understand kind of what environmental services does and how they can work with their environmental service manager to improve their infection prevention program in environmental services. So if we look at the F880 infection control tag, that talks about establishing that program to provide the safe, sanitary, and comfortable environment and prevent the development and transmissions of communicable disease and infections. And it talks about that it must be based on the facility assessment and accepted national standards. So really, you're going to want to make sure that your infection prevention program for environmental services is aligned with your facility assessment and that you're reviewing everything at least annually. You can flip to the next slide there. So when you look at accepted national standards, it might be difficult to figure out what am I looking for. And so I went through infection control in the state operations manual and just listed out what they list actually in the state operations manual as accepted national standards, just for places to start. There are many other great resources, but this is what they specifically list if you're looking for a credible source. So next slide, please. And when you're looking at building your environmental services program and your infection control program into your facility assessment, there's a couple of tools that you can use. So one is a CDC ICAR tool. Module 4 talks specifically about environmental services, and Module 9 talks about laundry handling services. And if you are a new infection preventionist, or if you are looking to amend your current program, the Wisconsin Department of Human Services has a great infection preventionist starter kit. And so I've included a link there on this slide. And the other thing is to make sure that if changes occur in your EVS services, if you use different products, if you get a different vendor, if you find a weakness, or if you need to do different training, that you are actually updating your facility assessment as those changes occur. Next slide, please. So we'll go to the first poll question. And I did put the questions on the next slide as well. So if you are not able to answer the poll, you can put your answers in chat. But where do you feel you're weakest in your infection control environmental services program? So there's some options. If you think something else is a weakness for you, you can throw that in the chat as well. So we're going to take about a minute to complete this poll, and then hopefully by the end, we can see if we provided you some tools that you can use to feel more confident in your EVS infection control plan.
So we are starting to get some responses in. And surveillance and auditing seems to be the biggest area of concern, Jess.
Well, we've got some tools to help. Do you want to share those results?
Yep,
Okay,
they're on their way.
awesome.
So there you go. Are you able to see them?
Yep, yep.
Okay.
Um, big lead on the surveillance auditing issues. Very good. I'm going to click out of this.
Okay.
All right. Can you go back one slide for me?
That one?
Yep, thank you.
Mhm.
So when we're thinking about your EVS program, there are different core components to incorporate. And one is integrate EVS into a culture of safety and make sure that you're including your environmental service managers in your infection prevention meetings and that there's clear goals and responsibilities and accountability for that program. When you are doing education and training, make sure that staff really recognize the importance of their jobs because they are very much staples in your infection prevention process in the building. Make sure that they know how to protect themselves while they're doing their jobs. And make sure that when you're making their education and training plan, that you're considering any reading, learning, or language barriers that are present in your building. If you have people that are not English as a first language, or if you have people that are not able to read, then you need to adjust your training program to make sure that you're covering all of your staff's education needs. In selecting products, making sure you're working as a team to select those correct disinfectants and equipment, and making sure the supply and the equipment is in good repair. And make sure you're using your supplies and equipment per the manufacturer guidelines. Standardize your processes. That way that staff can make the choice to do the easiest and the right thing. And monitoring adherence, auditing, and making sure you're getting that bi-directional feedback. So you're going to do formal audits, but you're also going to do informal rounds. And encourage that bi-directional feedback, because if there are issues that are causing them not to do the right things, those are things to address through QAPI. You don't want to hear for the first time when a state surveyor is in the building that the staff are using a workaround because there's not enough product, the equipment is broken, or they can't reach the right product on the top of the shelves because they're not tall enough and they don't have a stool. Provide feedback, so make sure you're addressing issues in infection prevention and in your QAA meetings, using that QAPI process again to improve quality and address issues. And be sure that you're focusing on areas of weakness on your education and facility assessments. And then educate your staff, your residents, and your family, and celebrate those wins so that you give everybody engagement and encouragement to do the right thing in infection prevention. So we can move along to the next slide. So EVS is really focused on interrupting that chain of infection. You don't want your infected patient and your contaminated surface to then get onto clean hands, susceptible patients, and create another infected patient. So that cleaning and disinfecting is really interrupting that process. The next slide, please. So the goal of your EVS program to break that chain of infection, you're going to stop that infectious agent from entering the susceptible host. You're going to do that through cleaning and disinfecting the environment, using the correct product on the correct surface for the correct contact time. You're also going to want to make sure that your EVS staff are keeping themselves well and not coming to work when they're ill, that they are safe while they're performing their tasks, and that you're also including in your process pest control, animals, if you have animals in the facility, and biohazard and regular waste management. So we're gonna start with terminal and routine cleaning. There. So one of the main things to understand when somebody begins cleaning is that cleaning and disinfecting are not the same thing. Cleaning is going to physically remove the dirt and germs and impurities from the objects and surfaces, but it's not going to kill the germs that are left. We're thinking of things like soap and water to scrub, wash, and rinse. And cleaning is really the first step before you disinfect, because you want to disinfect a clean surface. Sanitizing, we're really not going to focus on because we have an immunosuppressed population in long-term care. So we're going to focus on disinfecting, and that's going to kill the remainder of the germs on the surfaces to lower the risk of spreading disease. And when we're thinking of disinfecting, we're using an EPA registered disinfectant product or a stronger bleach solution. And again, those objects and surfaces should be cleaned before they're disinfected. Next slide. So when you're choosing your products, again, you want to make sure that they're EPA approved. And there is a link to the EPA registered disinfectant by organism. You can search lots of different ways, but that's by organism. And if you look specifically for COVID, you're going to look, I believe, on list N, but there's a list for each organism. We're going to follow the manufacturer instructions for use. You're going to need certain products for certain surfaces. Bleach is a good kill-all, but it is very corrosive, so you're not going to want to use that on certain surfaces. Each product is going to have its own contact time. And you're going to want to make sure that you're labeling your cleaners and disinfectants, and make sure that if they expire, that there is the date and time written on there, so they're not used longer than they're going to be viable for, because then they're not killing what you need it to kill. If you are by chance having staff physically mix chemicals, you need to really make sure that you're validating that they know how to mix those chemicals. That really needs to be a skills and competency checklist. Make sure that they're not topping them off. And if you are having them mix, they need to make sure the correct PPE is worn during mixing and applications. An MSDS sheet needs to be available for all chemicals used, and make sure that your staff know how to access it in case they have an exposure. And really, pre-mixed solutions can remove a lot of the risk of all the mixing situations, because if they're mixing and they're not mixing correctly, your facility is not safe. Next slide. So when your EVS staff is starting off the day, they're going to be loading their carts, and so they need to have adequate supply and equipment that works. So there has to be processes in place to make sure that you're ordering supplies, that things are stocked where they need to be, equipment is taken care of and maintained, and that you have a replacement schedule for your EVS carts and other equipment. Make sure that your clean items are always separate from your dirty. You don't want your toilet brush sitting in the same area as your clean cloths. Your chemicals need to be locked when they're not in use, and your cart needs to be free of food, drink, and personal items that you're going to cross-contaminate with your dirty items. And that is something that is really a focus when state is there, that you're not going to have those food and drinks, because that is a high-risk situation. If you're using mops and cloths, then you need a process for reprocessing, and that you're reprocessing them per their manufacturer's instructions, so you're not ruining their integrity. Next slide. So when they go in to clean a room, they're going to want to prevent recontamination and standardizing the process. So when you're in general thinking about cleaning, you want to clean to dirty surfaces, high to low surfaces. And whether you start in a clockwise or a counterclockwise is not important, just that you follow through with the same direction through the room. Your isolation rooms are cleaned after your other rooms. The best practice is to use microfiber cloths and mops. and avoid double dipping them in your clean solution. And your privacy curtains really need to be cleaned on a routine basis when visibly soiled and after isolation is discontinued. Then moving to cleaning bathrooms. Bathrooms are cleaned last. So you'll want to stock supplies and empty your trash. Wash your sink and your tub, walls, the toilet is last, and then you mop the room as you exit. So not only do you want to plan for your day-to-day operations, but you also want to plan for emergencies. And by planning in this way, you'll have schedules so people know what to clean and when. They'll have checklists and logs so they can verify that things are done and that they're done in the proper order and on the proper schedule. You're going to want to process in case you're understaffed. Staff will decide what to do if they're understaffed, and they may not decide in the same priority level as the manager. So giving them that guidance is important. You're going to want to process for emergency. You have a pandemic and not enough people to come in and more areas to clean because of your surge capacity. So you're going to want to process to plan for those things. You want to process for your employees to report accidents and incidents, and you're going to want them to feel comfortable bringing concerns to you because their job is so important that we need to address their concerns and make sure that everybody is safe. And also include EVS workers in your employee health and immunization process, and that they're also educated on when they should come to work and when they should refrain from coming to work, and make sure that they're included in those processes. Here's a slide. It has some routine surveillance and cleaning resources that you can use in your facility to help audit and monitor your EVS cleaning process. And I'm not going to read through that. You can flip to the next slide. So we're going to move to cleaning of shared equipment and high-touch surfaces. Next slide. So when we consider cleaning of shared equipment, this is going to be an all facility, all hands on deck situation. It's not just EVS that's going to clean shared equipment. This little infographic kind of gives us some ideas of what may fall into this category. You might have activity items, you might have vital signs equipment, you might have just different things that residents are touching that you need to consider for cleaning. And you want to look through your building and see what those things are and make sure that they're addressed on a cleaning schedule. And then it's important to make sure you're doing skills training and competency testing for those that are responsible for cleaning, that they know how to use the correct chemical for the correct time on their correct surfaces, and that they know to make sure that those chemicals are not left where residents can get a hold of them. Make sure to clean surfaces between each resident and when they're visibly soiled. And it's very important to keep that disinfectant readily available so staff use it. If they have to go down to a closet each time they want to clean the lift between a resident, you're not going to see them do that. You want to put your disinfectant bottles and tubs on your carts when possible. People have used drawstring bags, and I think we've talked about it in prior sessions, how you can make sure to keep some of your vulnerable or confused residents safe while at the same time keeping your greater population safe from infection. Mattresses and pillows, something that every resident pretty much has. The mattress needs to be free from holes, tears, and excessive wear. If you're noticing those things, they need replaced or recovered. They need disinfected between residents, and they should be also on a schedule. Pillows need washed when they're dirty. They need washed between residents and per schedule, and wash or replace if the resident was ill. If either your mattress or your pillow get penetrated by body fluids, you need to discard them. and have a system in place to monitor for replacement of those items. Here are a couple different audit tools to use for cleaning of shared medical equipment. So moving on to high-touch surfaces, I found it interesting. APIC did a study of 11 facilities and 30 surfaces, and 92.3 of those were found to have a high level of fecal matter. The biggest offenders being handrails and equipment controls that were 4 times more likely to have high levels of contamination. But then looking also at your bed rails, dining room, lounge tables and chairs, beds and hallway surfaces were also listed among the top contaminated surfaces. So when you're planning your cleaning, those are things to really pay attention to. Next slide. So some examples of high-touch surfaces in your resident room are the door and drawer handles and knobs, light switches over bed tables, bed controls and rails, call light cords, your phones and your remotes, pull strings if your lights have pull strings, your vitals equipment. And then kind of moving on to the next slide, in your bathroom, faucets and shower head handles, grab bars, your toilet seats and your flush handles, the sink and countertops. So if you think of other surfaces we haven't talked about, go ahead and throw those in the chat, but just areas where people are touching frequently or a lot of different people are touching. You can go to the next slide. So this gives us an example of a tool we can use to audit cleaning performance in rooms. So moving on to laundry management. So we're going to want to make sure, first of all, that we have enough bed and bath linens that are in good condition and in sufficient quantity to take good care of your residents. And that we handle, store, process, and transport them to prevent the spread of infection. Realizing that deviations from these practices can cause high risk for resident infection, and we want to identify those and put corrective actions in place. And regardless of where your laundry is done, some people do their own, some people contract a laundry service offsite. You still have to ensure that they meet facility standards for their laundry care. And you need to make sure that your laundry room and your work area is clean per schedule. So when you think about your laundry room, you're thinking about your ironing boards, your folding surfaces, your floors, your walls, that those areas also are included in your EVS cleaning schedule. When you're handling laundry, contaminated laundry, you're going to treat it all as contaminated and use gown and gloves for sorting. It needs to be bagged and contained at the point of collection, and if it's leaking body fluid or blood, it needs to be a leak-resistant bag. You need to make sure that you're sorting and rinsing away from resident care areas, and that there's minimal agitation to avoid contaminating surfaces, air, and other people. When you're transporting it, hold the contaminated laundry and bags away from the body. Special precautions are not necessary because we're treating all laundry as contaminated. And really, double bagging is only needed if there's visible contamination coming through or it's leaking. There needs to be a schedule to clean and disinfect your linen carts when visibly soiled, and also per routine schedule. And make sure that you have separate carts for clean and dirty laundry. If you don't, they need sanitized in between, and you really should be completing audits to make sure that is done, because that would be a very important step. But it would be best practice to have separate carts. And when you're transporting clean laundry, make sure to cover and protect from debris during that transportation. So for laundry storage, covers aren't required for contaminated receptacles in resident care areas, but they may be preferred by the facility or required by your state law. I see most often that they are covered. But if you have a resident situation where they need it uncovered for their own well-being, then you could do that. Clean and contaminated laundry must always remain separate. So whether you have it in a separate room, a separate closet, a designated space with a closing door, and that closing door is left closed when not in use, and it cannot be easily accessible to your residents and visitors. And if you are using a fan in your laundry room, it needs to be going from clean to dirty. You don't want to be blowing dirty air back into a clean area. And it's really best practice to have it at a negative pressure compared to your clean storage so that you're keeping the airflow from clean to dirty. When you're processing laundry, you're going to want to make sure for detergents, additives, and equipment that you're following the manufacturer's instructions. Making sure that you're emptying the lint trap at least every day. If you're doing a lot of laundry, you may have to do it more frequently. You want to make sure that you have a process on site to identify and communicate any product allergies that your residents have to products you're using, and that you have a process to address those articles of clothing. Ozone cleaning processes are acceptable, but for temperatures, you have to make sure the correct temperature is used. If you're using a hot water process, it has to be 160 degrees for 25 minutes. If you're using low temperature, it has to be 71 to 77 degrees and have a chlorine or oxygen activated bleach added to the process. So when you're using laundry chutes, make sure things are bagged. You don't want aerosols flying all around the laundry chute. You want to make sure that PPE and hand hygiene supplies are always available at laundry sorting or areas in your facility. Your workflow should always prevent cross-contamination of clean laundry. You don't want to be drying dirty laundry through your clean laundry area. And again, fans don't allow air from soiled areas to enter clean areas. There are a couple tools for laundry service checklists and assessments. So putting this all together for quality improvement, you can flip to the next slide. You're going to want to make sure your infection preventionist is involved in your quality assessment and assurance committee with your environmental services manager. And you're going to report outcomes of your audits and surveillance and advise your committee of areas of concern, and also celebrate the areas where you're doing well. You always want to make sure that we're congratulating staff that are doing a good job. If participating in PLAPI activities to promote quality and decrease risk in high risk areas. So if you are noticing trends, then those are areas to re-educate, do competency auditing, troubleshoot, do a root cause analysis, look where you have problems and work to address those problems. Inform the team when there are industry updates in infection prevention and control. I think we saw that a lot at the beginning of COVID when we were looking at what products could we use and what is the best way to kill the virus. We want to act as a resource in infection prevention related discussions. They're going to look to the infection preventionist as the expert on the topic, and they're going to ask you questions. And it's okay not to know the answer all the time, but being able to have resources to find those answers is important. And you're going to use the data that you're collecting and reporting to shape the education plan and form your facility assessment in infection prevention and control. So kind of going into our last poll question. Did you learn something today that you can use to improve your EVS weak spot? And if you didn't, then please drop your questions or comments in the chat, and let's kind of open up a discussion.
So Jess, they are saying that they have learned something, so that's awesome. We have a ton of resources on our website for you related to surveillance and auditing. And if you have specific questions related to your facility that you would like to respond or ask one of us, Our emails will be on the last slide when we end today, so please feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to assist. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end that.
Okay. Did you already share the results?
I did.
Okay.
All right.
Is there anything in the chat that we need to go over?
Nothing at this point.
Okay.
And those are, I believe, your references, correct?
Yeah. Yep. And I mean, you may want to make your own tool and pick and choose between different things you like out of different tools as well.
All right, I am going to stop sharing for one moment because we did get a request to go into presentation mode, and I did not want to do that to you, Jessica, midstream while you were presenting. If I messed up the technology, I would be really frustrated if I was the speaker and somebody did that to me. So, Amy, I am not locating what you're telling me on that, and I don't know if it's the webinar versus meeting setup that we have. So. All right, I'm not gonna fuss with it. Patty, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
All right, we're gonna go back up here. Amy, if you want to give me technical guidance, I will take it.
So click right there, go down. If you go down to the right-hand corner, remember those 4 boxes? I told you to go to the left. One more, right? No, to the right. To your right, to the right.
That one.
Yep.
Okay.
Click on that. That'll be presentation mode for you.
Is that presentation mode?
Mhm.
Oh, I learned something. I apologize. See? You guys have to understand I'm old. All right.
I think I also forgot to mention that while you're finding the slide, we do have resources for an on-site visit from one of our partners called IPC Well, where they come into your building and they spend time with your frontline staff and your EVS staff and kind of evaluate your process one-on-one in a very informal session where they're able to ask questions and interact. And then IPC Well provides a report for the facility on ways to improve and let you know what you're doing well on. So if that's something that you are interested in, I can drop our email addresses in the chat and you can feel free to email one of us and we can make a referral to that group. It is free of charge and we'd be happy to set up that referral. So I'll drop our email addresses in the chat.
And I
Thanks,
will
Jess.
also add that if you've had a visit, but it's been over a year or so, or you have new staff in your building, feel free to ask for another one. We have the bandwidth to enable you to have a follow-up visit as well.
Yes. All right, Patty, we will kick us off with bloodborne pathogens and injection safety.
Okay, there's a comment though. I want to throw that out there. They used IPC well, found them very beneficial, and they got really good information. These people love to teach, so we only receive good feedback. So
Sure.
So the purpose of going over bloodborne pathogens and injection safety is more of a high-level review for you. But I do have to admit that as a previous director of nursing, this was not an area that I thought a lot about. We were fortunate enough to have some, other departments that helped us out with it. But when I started to research this material for the presentation, it does make you think about your programs. So I'm not going to do a poll question or ask you to put into chat, but I would ask you to think, when was the last time you looked at your bloodborne pathogen or your exposure plan? Kind of be honest with yourself. This requirement falls under OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, with the goal is to protect all of our employees. And this regulation applies to like nurses' aides. It applies to the maintenance staff, the dietary staff. Every person in your building falls under this regulation. And all healthcare organizations have to have a plan. And that's why I said, do you know what your plan has? Is it accessible to all of your staff? Do your maintenance people know what to do? What if something happens on the off shift? Are you getting all those phone calls at home that so-and-so got a needle stick or so-and-so got a splash in the eye? Because the program itself has to include what to do to handle sharps so that everyone does that safely, the procedures to follow if you have a blood or other exposure to infectious materials, which includes those needle sticks, how to handle hazardous waste, and includes environmental services and cleaning, handling laundry, which just went through, as well as the requirement to offer staff hepatitis vaccines. It sounds like a lot of kind of disjointed requirements, but they are related because there could potentially be exposure to pathogens or blood. The regulation does require teaching on hire, and generally that's probably covered in something like your Relias. Also requires annual education. But I would suggest that maybe you consider doing this in more of a all staff meeting, which gives staff the opportunity to ask questions that they might have. That's where you'll get, well, what happens if, and how do I do this? Some facilities have binders at the nurses station, which will include the step-by-step what to do on the off shift. Does your facility have a contract with a standalone clinic that staff would go to? And what happens if it's in the middle of the night? Is there a specific emergency room that staff should go to? Who do they have to call? Is there any authorization? Those are just all different things that you need to consider and make sure that are covered in your plan. Have you ever had your staff demonstrate the use of your eye wash station? You know what? I haven't. Has anyone had them demonstrate the use of the eye wash station? I know we checked it. We had a little checkoff sheet to make sure that it was operational, but actually I think that's a great idea.
That
Jana?
came up with the facility when we were talking about Legionella and their water management system.
Okay.
Testing of those eye wash stations, is that something that is on somebody's radar, or are they looking at it?
Well, I know I did it in my last two buildings. That was just something I did during my rounds, but knowing what I've learned since then about Legionella, did I run them long enough? I'm not sure I did. So, the record keeping is a requirement to prove that your staff has had the training, as well as any kind of log should be kept for any kind of an exposure. There are requirements by state as well as federal requirements. Serious injuries, there's regulations about how to report them and when to report them. And I believe that there has to be some reporting out to staff annually on the number and the type of injuries that you've had. So it does require that kind of record keeping. Some facilities or human resources will maintain it. Others, it falls under the administrator, but ultimately the requirement for this regulation would fall under the administrator for making sure that all these things are in place. I would suggest that any type of injury requires a root cause analysis. Somebody needs to interview that staff person to find out what happened. Was there a problem with the equipment? Is there a knowledge deficit? And based off of what you're finding, you need to put an action plan, a corrective action plan in place and put it through your QAPI program. We can move on, Jana. I have an eye wash station, checks on environmental rounds. And we also included in our waterborne plan testing for Legionella. Great, thanks, Candy. So we're going to just touch quickly on injection safety. It is part of standard precautions to make sure that nurses are following all the safe injection safety practices. I will mention that CDC has a great program and all kinds of materials in their One and Only campaign. But the guidelines for safe injection practices include that the injections should be prepared and administered aseptically, They should be prepared in a dedicated clean area. So that's not in the dirty utility room. It's not in the lunchroom. And if they are in a med room, the area needs to be clean with not a lot of extra things on the counter. Syringes should only be used to administer the medication to one patient. You can't change the needle and use the same syringe again. Nor should you use the syringe to re-enter a medication container. And remember that vials that say they are for single dose or single patient use do not have preservatives and should only be used for one patient. We can go on, Jana. As I mentioned, here's some other materials. This is a great poster. There's a link here for one needle, one syringe, only one time. There's an injection safety checklist. Use that for a competency. Use that for an education. It's right here for you. It's right off of the CDC website. It can go on. So injection safety also covers the point of care testing. And that's with the use of a single auto-disabling or the retractable finger stick devices. And obviously, this is a procedure that nurses should be washing their hands and putting gloves on. They need to clean the finger, clean the site with a prep pad. And as an old nurse, I was one of these people that always had to have things ready. And I used to, what I called, pack my pockets with everything I might need. And as I've got older and learned a lot more, I realized that all those things in my pocket are considered dirty. So in the last organization I worked with, we used a little tray. And I think Jana told the story that they went and bought styrofoam trays for this purpose, that they could put all their supplies on this tray. And that was their, your clean surface to go do your finger stick. And remember that if you're sharing glucose meters, they need to be designated for healthcare use, and you need to follow them clean them and disinfect them according to the manufacturer's recommendations. If you don't have instructions on how to clean them, it's probably not a healthcare device and you shouldn't be used in a nursing home. And even those devices that are single use, they still need to be clean and disinfected. There's some lists here to the different types of disinfectants that you can use, as well as the CDC guidance down here that talks about preventing infections during blood glucose monitoring and insulin administration. So we can go on. This is a great CDC clinical reminder that talks about finger stick devices. Use it for an in-service. A read puts a post-test with it, and there's an education for your clinical nurses. It's a really good material that they've put out there, and it's sourced here as well. Another great little poster says, be aware, don't share. This is for the insulin pens. And I know the needle gets changed on the end, but they're still intended for only one resident. Only one person can use this pen. It should have the resident's name on the sticker, as well as the date that's open and the date that it needs to be disposed of. And I would include that when you're doing your checks of your med cards. And if the labeling isn't there and the surveyor comes in and looks at that, you're going to get a tag for it. So you need to be educating and monitoring and ensuring compliance for this as well. So we can go on. We talked a lot about, or mentioned a couple times about disposal and handling of sharps. There is regulations on how needles should be disposed of. And this is in the FDA Food and Drug Administration. They have to be approved device or approved containers, and they can be purchased from many medical supply companies. I think I've seen them in the pharmacies. You can get them online. Most places have them mounted in the med carts, your med rooms. Some resident rooms also have them. I like the small ones if you're giving vaccines or TB tests, and especially if you don't have them in the rooms, you could take one in with you and just put your needle right in there. And that way there's no risk of anybody getting stuck with it. So I put this slide in here about staff education, and I think nursing training is changing a lot. And I'll give a real quick story somewhat related to this. Was recently in the hospital with a family member. And there was some questions about how the blood pressure machine was working. They thought it was not working. Well, they decided to try and take a manual blood pressure. And I have to say, I was somewhat embarrassed for our profession, but the young nurse could not do a manual blood pressure. So I think we can't assume that nurses nowadays are getting all the training, that they know how to administer injections. Have they withdrawn from a vial? Do they know how to do that? Do they know how to reconstitute? Do they even know the type of needles, the size of needles for sub-Q versus an intradermal versus an IM? I don't believe we can assume this when you're hiring staff anymore, that they need to, be educated on how to do all these things, or at least a competency validation that you feel comfortable that they have that skill set. And I would include blood glucose monitoring. And if they're starting IVs, that definitely needs to be included as well. IV therapy. And put that in your annual competency validations, and do your audits on your injection safety. Include that annually for your nurses. Watch them do a blood glucose check, make sure that they have that skill and they're maintaining the proper procedures to follow it, with their gloves and skin prep. It's just very, very important that we feel good about our nurses staff, but when we invest in them, then they feel better about themselves as well. So next slide. As with all the other materials, we have provided you with a lot of different resources here. I even put a comment beside one that said was very good. The WHO, the CDC, Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, as well as here's some audit tools down here for point of care blood testing and injection safety. That was the end of the part that I had to present today. What kind of questions are there for this or other materials that Jess may have covered, or something even from previous weeks?
Patty, we have a hand raised. I'm going to allow that person to talk.
Absolutely.
Katie, I think I've asked you to unmute if you want to go ahead.
It might have been a mistaken hand raise.
Yeah, that's fine. No
That's
problem.
fine. I did have one comment though, Patty, when we talked about the glucose monitors, I see that as an F-tag site frequently on 2567s when I'm reviewing, especially in facilities that have shared glucometers, and staff, if they've not been educated on how to clean the glucometer, they will use the closest thing, right? They might use an alcohol prep wipe, or they might use a bleach wipe. And it's not what the manufacturer's directions say. So there's an opportunity that's really quick and easy to do an education with your staff on how to clean those devices.
Right. A lot of facilities will have two devices on their med cards, so
Yeah.
one can be sitting there with a wipe on it, maintaining that wet and contact time, and then the staff can go down the hall, and do the blood glucose check. I think there was a question in there.
Yeah, there's a question. Are there places that offer free training for drawing blood on patients? That is a great question. Why don't you send that to us in an email, and we will check with our peers and let us know what state you're in, Sandy, because that helps us too, because we work across the 3 states. If we can get a state point of contact for you, we will do that. I don't know. Patty, do you know of any? The phlebotomy, the drawing blood, that seems to be, because a lot of nursing facilities are doing their own phlebotomy now, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
When I looked into a program probably 6 months ago, granted I'm in Iowa, I did not find anything for free. I just found training programs that you had to pay for. We do have a comment in the chat about if there's a link to the bloodborne pathogen slides, and all of the slides are in the link. We just went in a different order, so they should all be there.
And if they're not, Candy, let us know and we will send them out to you. While we have a few minutes, I did want to take this last opportunity. We ran out of time last week, so we didn't get to this, but this is the slide to continue the conversation with Superior Health. We have what's called Superior Health Connect, and it's an opportunity for you to go in and get weekly updates from us on the work that we're doing, and then to communicate peer-to-peer around specific topics that might be posted there. So it's an opportunity for you to join us. And if you want to scan your phone, if you have a QR code, there is the QR code, or use the live link that's on this website, on this slide. So any other questions about bloodborne pathogens, injection safety, or environmental services? I will share that there's been a lot of conversation around risk assessments and the facility assessment. And we've been getting a lot of questions from facilities, as we should be, because all of a sudden we're getting all this information that the facility assessment is going to be updated. And when it comes to the topics that we're talking about today, for your bloodborne pathogen and environmental services training, when you're talking about how you staff your building, I would encourage you to have that conversation with whoever is creating the facility assessment. It should be interdisciplinary now. Those are the new requirements. Talking about the number of housekeepers that are required for the type of patients and the patient infections that you're entering into your building. No longer, in my humble opinion, is it going to be status quo staffing one housekeeper to X number of square feet, because that used to be how we kind of determined staffing. And I think we're going to have to look at not only the size of our facility, but also the type of residents that are in our facility, and utilizing our infection data to kind of drive what that looks like from manpower hours and from training and competency. Housekeeper competency training is a thing. It's not just clinical staff being competency trained on skills, but when we get to I think it's week 5 that we're going to talk about competency of staff. We will talk about, and I will bring up about housekeeping and environmental services, because they're just such a critical component of good infection control programs in keeping your residents and everybody in the building safe and healthy. Any questions? I just brought that topic up and I'm hesitant to do it, but I know there's questions about it. We've gotten questions about risk assessments. We've gotten questions about facility assessments, and boy, do we get questions about enhanced barrier precautions. So we have a few minutes. So if you have questions that didn't get answered last week, or you would like more information on, now's your opportunity to kind of just, bring it out and let's talk about it. We're here to listen and kind of work through and problem solve with facilities. So.
Something kind of to look forward to is that we're in the process of working with IPC well to develop environmental service training plans, so that if you have your own or in-house service, or if you contract an environmental service from another company, you can use tools to train them and validate that they understand what they're learning.
So, question in the chat from an anonymous source: do you implement EBP for all pressure ulcers? And the answer to that is yes. You should be using enhanced barrier precautions for all stage open pressure ulcers. Correct me if I'm wrong, ladies, but if it's a stage 1, like a reddened area, you would not need to use enhanced barrier precautions.
No, they would fall under the chronic wound.
Yeah.
What's the other? There's another question here.
It's about isolation carts. And where do they need to be? How far away from the room? Can you have it inside or outside?
So that one depends. That one is a gray space. So I would look at what your facility, how many residents you have first and foremost in enhanced barrier precautions. If you have 1 or 2 residents that are on enhanced barrier precautions and they're on separate areas of the facility, then I would have an ISO cart outside of their room. If you have a unit that has 10 to 15 residents, or the majority of the residents are enhanced barrier precautions, I would put isolation carts in between every suite so that staff are not having to walk, because the rule of thumb is that the more difficult you make it, or the distance that you make staff go to get something, the less likely they are to perform the task that you need them to perform. You've got to have the tools for them really close by. And I would look at what your fire marshal says, what your safety devices say for your state. Does it all have to be on one side of the hall, which it should be? I believe that's the requirement. And the width of your hallway and what that spacing looks like. So that's a conversation about safety with your fire marshal. They can be, yeah, garbage cans for PPE. Ideally, we would put them inside the room to doff. That is, if the room is too small, what would be the best location? Boy, Megan, that's a great question. You know, I know they really shouldn't be in the hallway. A small garbage can inside the room that is emptied frequently. Jess, Patty, any suggestions on that one?
It's
I think
about-
that's tough. We had small rooms in our last facility, and so we kind of we doffed in the bathroom because it was right near the exit and
Oh,
it was separated from the room.
Yeah, I've had small garbage cans where it would hold about 2 gowns and like 2 sets of PPE that were removed. And we just taught staff to bag it and remove it with them. That was one of the steps that we added so that we weren't constantly overflowing garbage. When cleaning a resident in EBP, do the ES workers wear gowns and gloves? No, not unless they're going to be direct patient care and they're going to come in directly in contact. And the caveat to that is, are they changing dirty linens on the bed of the resident that was enhanced barrier precautions? If they are going to be removing soiled linens from the bed, then yes, they would need to use PPE. But if they are not, and they're not coming in contact with the resident, then no, they do not need to wear gown and gloves and enhanced barrier precautions. Nurses, did I answer that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a comment about Sam Evan Schulman.
Yeah. No, they are not, Deb. And I think that comment about not having ISO carts everywhere. So in an ideal world, you would have private rooms and every resident would be in a private room and you could keep their enhanced barrier precaution, PPE in a cubicle before you got into the room. There are actually rooms that are designed that way, that are fortunate enough to have a sink by the door with a cubby that they can put that PPE in, and the room is big enough that you can don at the door and go in. In it, that's an ideal world. The reality is we have suites. We have facilities that have shared bathrooms. We have facilities with 2 and 3 bed and 4 bed wards. And your ISO carts have to be outside of the room. That is the recommendation. It's not a requirement, though. It is the recommendation and best practice to have them outside of the room. So
We have a comment from Alicia saying that they're getting the ISO door hangers for the resident rooms, keeping them in their closet until they're needed. And then having the appropriate sign on them. So that's a good idea, as long as your door still closes.
yeah, and my recommendation is look at your policy, follow your policy. Does your policy make sense and does it match the CDC requirements? And can everybody in your facility speak to how they were educated and they're all following your policy and process as written correctly? I think that's where facilities get into trouble, is where they have a policy and then staff aren't aware of the policy and they go off the range and they do some other process that they think is correct and it doesn't match your policy, and somebody, of course, a surveyor sees it, and then they start to see a trend. And when they interview your staff, the staff say, no, we've not been educated. You know the process. It's the snowball that rolls downhill.
So while you're finishing up, I'm gonna put a link to our survey, if everybody wouldn't mind clicking that and taking the survey, give us feedback. It's how we learn how to better help everybody. Just while
Alicia, that's great. And I think, you know, I can just say education, 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 and pay attention. And if you are in, pay attention to what your state is providing for education from your health departments on this topic, because they're going to be the ones that set the tone for how things are regulated in your particular state and area. There's going to be nuances until this gets ironed out, just like there were, when I liken this to when we took bed rails off back in my day when I was a brand new administrator and the side rails came off beds and we were all like, oh my gosh, I don't know how this is going to be. It was terrible. I remember the stress, the frustration, like, I don't know if we're going to do this right. And I think unfortunately, it just took time to get the nuanced policies and process and how we were being surveyed and what the expectations were. So, is there any other questions? And if not, thank you all. And so glad that you're still talking with us about enhanced barrier precautions, because we sense your frustration. Boy, do we get your frustration. And, there's just been a ton of stuff coming at you. It has been crazy the last month and a half of new things coming out. So thank you all. It is a lot and it is a huge change, Alicia. And I have so much empathy for you guys having to live the dream with this in your buildings and rolling it out in the midst of everything else that you do. So next week, it is week 4, and we are looking forward to having you all back here. Thank you again for joining us. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We are here. This is our statement. I just put that out there on so you can see it. Please reach out. You've got our emails, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you.